welcome to a spooky edition of Midwest Crime Corner. I'm Oksana Bonita. Let's get into it. Candyman, 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 Candyman. Candyman is one of my favorite horror films of all time. It is a combination of truth and fiction that comes together so brilliantly to form and create a new modern day boogeyman. Being a little kid in the 90s, I loved going to our local mom and pop movie rental store.
I've got to return some videotapes.
I love walking through the store and looking at the horror movie cases. The cases always stood out to me, and they made me wonder what the movie was about, and usually filled me with fear and excitement. In the 90s and early 2000s, there were horror movie staples and classics. These movies and their villains were almost a rite of passage to watch and make it through during a sleepover, and Candyman was one of those for me. With Halloween fast approaching, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at the truth behind Candyman and what inspired a horror icon. To understand Candyman is to understand American history, more specifically African American history, slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and the modern day struggle of those living in areas known as the projects, like Cabrini Green in Chicago. Candyman is a mashup of all those things and a symbol for the pain and the suffering endured by so many slaves and African Americans. Similar to how Godzilla was spun out of the pain and endurance of the Japanese people post atomic bombs as a way to process and symbolize what had happened. But that's not to say that there isn't criticism of the movie. Some people have said that the movie panders to a white savior trope, and that it also plays into racist stereotypes about African Americans. And I can understand those perspectives. I see them in the movie, but I'm not here to say whether or not that was the intent or if the movie is right or wrong. I still think overall that the movie holds value in terms of writing, acting, and overall storytelling. And in general, it does hold a special place in horror cinema and black cinema, respectively. I will be talking about the 1992 Candyman movie, obviously, so there will be spoilers. If you want to go watch the movie beforehand, I highly suggest that you do so before we dive into this. It's available for streaming on Peacock with the subscription, YouTube Premium, AMC Plus, Amazon Prime, Google Play, and Apple Play. The story of Candyman originates from the twisted mind of Clive Barker.
We have such sights to show you.
In a short story, The Forbidden, the story takes place in Barker's native Liverpool, highlighting the struggles of segregation and the overall culture that comes from living in poor and urban areas. Barker was working on his movie Nightbreed, while director Bernard Rose was also working on a movie at the same studio lot, and they began a friendship. Bernard Rose liked the story The Forbidden so much that he asked Barker if he could turn it into a film, and Barker agreed. Bernard, who was also from the UK, was currently living in LA to work on his new film. He was so shocked by what he had learned by what was currently happening in the Chicago projects at the time that he changed the setting of the movie to Chicago, specifically to Cabrini Green. While Rose was scouting for the film in Chicago, he discovered the notorious Cabrini Green housing projects, which they used to film at in the movie. In fact, there are several shots in the movie where there are active gang members in the shots. For over 10 years at this point, Cabrini Green had been known for its poor construction, violence, and high rates of robbery. Nestled on Chicago's near north side, Cabrini Green was known as one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in all of the United States. Dating all the way back into the 1850s, the area where Cabrini Green was later built was known as the Shanties, was built on a low-lying land along the Chicago River, with the population at the time predominantly being that of Swedish and Irish immigrants. The area later earned the nickname Little Hell because of the nearby gas refinery that produced large pillars of flames. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the area was known as Little Sicily because of the large Italian immigrant population. As far back as 1929, the media was making note of Chicago's near north side, contrasting differences in the social and economic standards amongst the residents at the time. It was also in 1929 that the first low income public housing unit was built. By 1942, 54 two-story housing buildings with 586 units in them, known as Cabrini homes, were built. Initial speculation puts the population at roughly 75% white and 25% African American. In 1957, 15 more Cabrini homes were built. with 1,925 units in them, respectively. A few more years after this, in 1962, the William Green homes were built, giving the area an additional 1,096 units, with the William Green housing extension led to the area being known as Cabrini Green. By the time the 1970s came, there were 3,600 housing units, and living in Cabrini Green came with a reputation. With the population of Cabrini Green mostly being poor, and as slowly services began to dry up, repairs and maintenance became scarce. As funding became non existent for the public housing units and their maintenance, soon elevators stopped working and the buildings began to deteriorate. In 1982, a study from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development found that the Chicago Housing Authority was one of the worst managed public housing agencies in the nation. While the 1970s sitcom Good Times is set in Cabrini Green, it was usually anything but good times in Cabrini Green. At its height, Cabrini Green housed 15,000 people. By the time the mid 1990s came, the Chicago Housing Authority began tearing down dilapidated mid and high rise buildings, with the final one being torn down in 2011. In addition to Cabrini Green, a bizarre unaliving that took place in ABLA high rise in Chicago's near south side was added to the Candyman mythos. In the movie, Helen is doing research into the Candyman story for a thesis on urban legends while studying at the University of Chicago, Illinois. While conducting her research, Helen discovers the story of a recent unaliving in a local housing project known as Cabrini Green. The recent unaliving, along with previous ones, have had the locals attributing them to Candyman. In the movie, Helen is told about Ruthie Jean and how she was in her apartment in Cabrini Green. Ruthie could hear banging and smashing, and so she dialed 911 and she told them that someone was coming through her walls, and the 911 operator did not believe her. She called 911 again, and they still did not believe her. And by the time any help had arrived, Ruthie Jean was found unalive. The real story that is based off of is far more tragic. Miss Ruthie Mae McCoy was 52 years old in 1987. Miss Ruthie lived alone at the end of a corridor on the 11th floor of a 15-story public housing apartment building known as the ABLA. Miss Ruthie also battled daily with schizophrenia. On a night in April, Ruthie had phoned the Chicago Police Department, informing them that the people next door were tearing down their place and that they had thrown her cabinet down, implying her bathroom cabinet. She went on to say that you can reach my bathroom. They want to come through the bathroom. Roughly 20 minutes after Ruthie had placed her call, police had yet to arrive, and a neighbor of Ruthie's was now making a call to the Chicago Police Department. They had heard loud pops coming from Miss Ruthie's apartment. Around 10 minutes after that second 911 call was placed, 4 officers arrived to the apartment building. They made several attempts to get inside Ruthie's apartment, including hunting down a spare key to no avail. With no success, they left. The next evening, the Chicago Police Department received a call from a concerned neighbor of Miss Ruthie's stating that she was worried about Miss Ruthie because she hadn't made her usual stops by her apartment throughout the day to stop and talk. Police responded, got in touch with the building's janitor, who again told the police that they did not have a spare key to Miss Ruthie's apartment. With that, the police left again. The next day, the same neighbor who had called the Chicago Police Department the day prior called again with the same concerns as before about Miss Ruthie. This time, about half a dozen Chicago police officers and about 4 to 5 Chicago Housing Authority security guards arrived at the apartment building. They knocked at the door with no answer. With no way in and with the proposal to break down the door denied, they left. Finally, the next day, after almost 4 days, a carpenter was called out to Miss Ruthie's apartment. It was then the access was gained to her apartment. After a hole was drilled through the lock of her front door, Miss Ruthie was found unalive in her bedroom. She was found laying on her side in a pool of blood, with her hand over her chest. The autopsy revealed that Miss Ruthie was shot 4 times, with just one of the shots being the fatal one. The medical examiner stated that Miss Ruthie wouldn't have survived her injuries even if she had been rushed to the hospital. Because the housing project in which Ruthie lived in was built simply and cheaply, that left Ruthie and others vulnerable to those wishing to prey upon them. The housing units were all the same. The only thing that really changed was the amount of bedrooms per unit. Other than that, they're pretty much a mirror of each other. So on the other side of Ruthie's bathroom was the bathroom to the neighbor's unit. And to make it easier for the maintenance crew to access any of the pipes and the walls, it was added in the design plans to add basically a crawl space between each unit. All they had to do was remove the screws on the medicine cabinets that were in the bathrooms, pop them out. They could go inside and go in the wall do their maintenance, and get back out. And that is exactly what the intruders did that night to Miss Ruthie. They entered the wall through the empty neighboring unit to Miss Ruthie's, and they came in through her bathroom mirror. Miss Ruthie wasn't having delusions that night when she called 911. Miss Ruthie was telling the truth. Along with discovering the story of Ruthie Jean in the movie, Helen discovers the origins of Candyman. Candyman had been a real man in the movie timeline, named Daniel Robitaille, an African American man born in the late 1800s. Daniel was the son of a slave, and he grew up to become a renowned painter. After Daniel fell in love with and impregnated a white woman, her father sent a lynch mob after him, sawing off his right hand, his painting hand, and then smearing a honeycomb across his chest in order to attract bees, stinging him to death. After which his corpse was burned and his body was erected on the grounds where Cabrini Green now stands. Kind of your typical urban legend mythos. Horrible tragedy occurs many years ago, and now the ghost of said person haunts the area. The ground is cursed, that type of a thing. While the death of Daniel Robitaille is not based on any one true occurrence, it is a death spun from real lynchings that occurred throughout the United States after the Civil War, during Jim Crow, and segregation. At the beginning of Helen's Candyman journey, Helen decided to test out summoning Candyman in the mirror for herself. Nothing came of it until a few days later. After being assaulted while getting too hands-on for her Candyman research, Helen was alone in a parking garage when Candyman suddenly appeared, hypnotizing her into a trance. Candyman explains to Helen that because she has pulled back the veil and exposed Candyman for the myth that he is, similar to how Dorothy does this to the Wizard of Oz, although Oz doesn't become a murderous, vengeful spirit in order to prove a point, but Candyman explains that because Helen has done this, he must now basically prove a point to show her what a real bad guy can do. The people in Cabrini Green need to fear him again. Helen then passes out. The next part of the movie, I don't feel like it makes a whole lot of sense, but that kind of tracks for horror movies during this time. So, eh, you know. mm. I like the rest of the movie so much. It's kind of a non-issue for me. It's just a little clunky in this part of the movie, but it's fine. Helen wakes up in the apartment of the neighbor of Ruthie Jean, whom she had talked to with earlier in the movie, Anne Marie. Helen wakes up in Anne's bathroom, covered in blood, and discovers that Anne's dog has been decapitated, along with Anne's baby son being missing. Anne Marie and Helen struggle as police arrive and apprehend Helen. Helen's husband bails her out of jail, only for Candyman to appear to Helen again before cutting her neck and murdering her innocent friend Bernadette, who just so happened to show up at Helen's apartment at the time and framed the murder on Helen. Helen was then shipped off to a local psychiatric hospital in preparation for her upcoming murder trial for the death of her friend Bernadette. While trying to prove her innocence to her psychiatrist, Helen looks over at a nearby mirror and calls Candyman 5 times, with Daniel Robitaille promptly showing up and virtually gutting the psychiatrist from behind, freeing Helen and then yeeting out the window. Upon leaving the psychiatric hospital, Helen returns home only to find that her husband has been a cheating slimeball and has in fact been cheating with one of his female students from the university. From there, Helen continued her Candyman pursuit and attempted to locate Anne-Marie's baby Anthony. Helen was successful in finding Candyman's makeshift lair. It was there that Candyman asked Helen to, quote,
Surrender to me now, and he shall be unharmed.
to ensure Anthony's safety in exchange for immortality with him. Later on, with more discoveries, Helen finds a large mural that depicts Daniel Robitaille next to a white woman who resembled her, presumably his lover when he was alive, with the message, "It was always you, Helen," implying that Helen was the reincarnation of Robitaille's lover. Candyman then promised Helen that if she helped him incite fear in the residents of Cabrini Green and make them believe in him again, he would release baby Anthony. A large bonfire was set to take place, with Candyman placing baby Anthony inside a large structure that was set to be aflame. Helen heard the baby crying from within the structure and went inside to save him, all while the residents of Cabrini Green gathered and then lit the structure on fire. Candyman wanted them all to die within the structure as it burned, but Helen was able to attack Candyman and get away with baby Anthony while Candyman died in the fire. Helen would succumb to her burn injuries and die, only to come back as a vengeful spirit and murder her cheating husband Trevor with Candyman's hook as he summoned her in the bathroom mirror. So not a traditional horror movie trope with Helen dying at the end despite all of her efforts. In fact, she is now a vengeful spirit. The only glimmer of hope is that baby Anthony was saved. who in Jordan Peele's continuum is all grown up and is the main antagonist of his Candyman film. Tony Todd's performance of Candyman is fantastic. His stare, his voice, and just everything he brought to the table to make Daniel Robitaille Candyman in a reality. Candyman is truly a horror icon. That is going to wrap it up for today's video. I hope you liked my deviation from my typical true crime content. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll catch you in the next one.